This is the Trauma Recovery Resilience Podcast, and this is for you if you are interested in compassion, connection, and relationships, and how we can all work together, creating services that do not add to harm, but rather seek to support recovery from it. I'm your host, Lisa Cherry, and this is your time to sit back and listen in on conversations that make a difference. Well, today I am very blessed because I am joined by Annie, who goes by the Twitter handle of Safeguarding Survivor. And one of the things that I'm really interested about talking to Annie about really is how she has managed to take something that has had very little voice, very little platform, and to create a platform and a space for educating in social work, opening up voices for other people who've been through similar things. And so I'm just really excited to have Annie with us here today. Hello, Annie.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much for having me. It's quite an honour for me too.
Oh, it's lovely. I don't even know where we start because there's just so many avenues that we could go into. So I guess the first thing we need to do, because obviously the whole world isn't on Twitter, and I know sometimes it can feel like the whole world's on Twitter, but for people who don't know you, I guess the first thing that would be really good would be to talk about how are you here on this podcast with myself? That seems like as good a place as any.
So my real name is not Annie. I'll start by saying that. And I work under a pseudonym, and that's to protect the identities of me and my children, some of whom are still in the care system. So I'll start with that immediately. And I guess, how did I get here? I was very kindly asked by yourself, and we found each other on Twitter a good few years ago, I think now. And I joined Twitter because what I wanted to do was promote my blog, which is survivingsafegarden.co.uk. And the blog is a parent's guide to the child protection process. And it's written almost entirely from a parent's perspective. I do have some guest posts on there from social workers, foster carers and others. But in the main, it's really a sort of a map, a navigation guide to and for parents who find themselves at the sharp end of child protection and who are bewildered, who are confused, frightened, feel disempowered, and who are not sure what they're supposed to be doing. And the reason that I've written all of that, and the reason that I still continue to write and continue to talk to people and train social workers and help parents, is because I have been through that myself. And that began in 2012 when the local authority issued care proceedings in respect of my older children, and I fell pregnant during those proceedings. Then once those first set of proceedings had concluded, went on to then go through a concurrent set of proceedings in respect of my newborn. So the local authority did remove my newborn at birth. He was 6 days old, and I went through the very painful process of care proceedings in respect of him, where the local authority's plan was adoption at all costs, I have to say. And I contested that, and I started to reflect quite vividly and clearly on the issues and concerns that had been raised about my parenting and about me, and start to look inward a bit more. And I went and got the help that I needed, and fought very, very, very hard to turn my life around and demonstrate that change and sustain that change, and was very successful in that my son was returned to me after 258 days. Got the numbers the wrong way around there in the care system. And I think for the first sort of 6 months, I was just terrified. But then I began to feel quite angry, and I began to have a lot of different emotions because I had suffered a trauma of the removal of my child, a trauma in respect of the care proceedings, both the first and the second set. And I needed an outlet, and the outlet was writing. So I started to write this blog, Surviving Safegarden, never thinking anybody would read it because it was selfishly kind of for me at first. And with the thanks of Twitter, really, because it kind of exploded on Twitter first. And yeah, now I get 15,000 hits a month. People contacting me from all over the world to ask for my help. I just wish there was more hours in the day and more of me to be able to help more. So I guess that's why I'm here to talk about things from a parent's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a society that's very punitive and very punishing towards mothers. And were you in care yourself?
Yes, I
Yeah.
was. I was abused at a very young age by my biological father, and this was not stopped by my mother, and I wasn't protected at all. And at a young age, the local authority did get involved, and I was put into foster care. And so, yes, I was a care leaver, and the way that I left care actually on its own was not straightforward. It was very, very different back then in care in the sort of the 90s. And I was just able to run riot, to be honest. You know, I didn't have to go to school. I didn't have to do anything at all because nobody could make me. So I learned the power that I had immediately as I looked after a child, that nobody could make me do anything that I didn't want to do. But unfortunately, because of my background and my upbringing, I tended to lean towards relationships with older men, and found myself in a relationship at the age of 14 with a 28-year-old man. And that seemed fine to me. That seemed completely normal. And the local authority did try to stop that relationship and try to protect me from it. But because they didn't have the power to stop me from going out, they just couldn't. And that relationship continued. He then went on and passed me around his friends at the age of 15. And then at the age of just 16, a member of his family also began what I believed to be a relationship with me. And he was a 38-year-old man and I was a 16-year-old girl. And I fell pregnant with my son, Johnny. He absolutely saved me, because I think had I not have fallen pregnant at that point, I was at a point in my life where it was very obvious the path that I was going to take. It was going to end up in drugs and prostitution, because I didn't know anything else. And not that I was a drug taker at all. I hadn't taken drugs, but it was going that way. I was mixing with people who were taking drugs and who thought nothing of passing me around their friends and exploiting me in that way. And I didn't necessarily see anything wrong with it, although I didn't feel great, but I'd learned from a very young age to be able to shut myself off from what was happening to my body and go into a different place in my mind. So it actually, I always say to myself, I've been through worse, because now looking back as a child, that's a horrendous image. But at the time, I didn't feel like that. And when I fell pregnant with Johnny, it did stop me in my tracks. But what unfortunately then happened was the foster carer that I was with decided she didn't want me there with a baby. And at 8 weeks pregnant, I was made homeless by the local authority, who put me into a refuge because they didn't have anywhere else for me to go. And really at 16, they didn't have any responsibility legally towards me anymore at that point. Things are obviously considerably different now. And then it was a case of you need to find your own house and you're on your own, mate. And I did find my own house and I did secure my own tenancy. But that was, there was nobody whatsoever, no guiding hand. I didn't have any family. I didn't have any friends. I didn't have a relationship at all. And I didn't have the support of the local authority either. So very, very, very much alone as a child.
And phenomenally let down at every corner. We call the grooming that you're describing, we call, child sexual exploitation now. And it does always make me smile, because I just think this stuff's been going on for a very long time. We can call the moving of drugs all over the place county lines. We can call sexual abuse of children CSE or CSA. But, this stuff has been going on for a long time, and you were sought and groomed, and that hand of protection, as you say, you were failed at every turn, which is, I guess, what makes really your story just so much more of interest to people in terms of developing much better practice, not just in terms of thinking about you as a child, but actually thinking about Annie, the adult that Annie became, and then, of course, the children that Annie had, and how to work with those children. So I guess what would be really a useful conversation, a thoughtful conversation, would be around, because I'm a mother, so it's really difficult for me when I listen to you talk, as I'm sure it is for so many, to even begin to imagine the realities of the painfulness of your child being removed at birth. So I have been the child removed and separated, and the thought of that happening to my children is very difficult to comprehend and not a place I want to hang out in. And I guess that's why listening to voices of women who've had these experiences is actually really difficult for people to hear, which is why I'm so grateful that you have put that voice bang smack in the arena. And that in turn then gives permission for everybody else, if you like, to go, well, yeah, I've got that story too, you know. So thinking about what was going on at that time, how on earth did you manage to, because by getting your child back, you did break the cycle, right?
I did absolutely break the cycle. And I think that that's something that more people can do than is actually there's an idea about parents or mothers in particular. I mean, it always seems to be mothers that get it, but there's an idea that they just go on and have more and more and more kids, and that they can't break the cycle themselves, so they need help, and they need somebody to control the contraception, or they need somebody to oversee their lives in that way. But actually, you know, sometimes all you need is somebody to believe in you. And I had never had that. I had never, ever, ever had that one person that said, you've got this. I believe in you. I'm proud of you. You're doing amazing. You will get through this. And very fortunately, and I mean very fortunately, because this is not, you know, this is something that's extremely local to me. But I was lucky enough to have the help and support from an advocacy service called Families in Care, and they are independent advocates for parents going through the child protection system. They are qualified social workers, so it's not peer advocacy, although you know that's something that we or I certainly intend to change, and am changing. But having Families in Care standing next to me was probably one of the most powerful things that got me through it. And I think we underestimate parents, and particularly mothers' ability to get through things if they just have that tool, if they just have that person standing next to them saying, you can do this, then you do feel empowered, and you do feel able to believe in yourself a little bit more because somebody else does. So I think that was one of the major, you know, I can't negate and say that this was all me and I got my son back all on my own. You know, I had support from Families in Care, and I certainly wouldn't be in the position I'm in without them. However, it did take, they weren't there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it did take an awful lot of guts and determination to sustain yourself through that, because I mean, he was 6 days old, my youngest son. He's now 6. He was just 6 in July. And I gave birth to him, and I stayed, you know, he was delivered onto my stomach, and he was breastfed, and I stayed with him for those 6 days in hospital. He never slept in the crib. He slept on me always. And we mastered breastfeeding. I'd breastfed my other children, but it's always different with each one, obviously. And we master breastfeed, and I used to sing to him. In fact, literally just last night, I sang him the song that I used to sing to him in hospital, and I explained to him that this is the song that Mama used to sing to you when you were a tiny baby. And he said, I can't remember it. And I said, well, of course you can't, because you're 6. But I used to sing You Are My Sunshine to him in hospital. And I used to say to him that I wouldn't stop fighting. I would keep going. I knew what they were planning, the local authority, and I knew that it would be a hell of a fight. And I knew that it might be that I lost the battle, but that the war was not over, and I was going to fight with everything I had, because I had woken up, and it's too easy for me to play the victim and say, you know, that I had this horrific childhood, and because of that I went on and my substandard parenting was because of my horrific childhood. I just had nobody to help me and nobody to support me. That's true. That is true. Absolutely, that is true. However, I also made some really bad choices, and I didn't always learn from my mistakes, and I didn't always prioritize my children, and I didn't always put them first and think about what my behaviors or what my choices, how that would impact upon them. And I've got to own that. I've got to take responsibility for that, because it's part of your growth as a person. It's part of your healing, I think, as a person. But it also, I think, enables you to stand up. Once you're able to own your own, stuff, nobody can get to you. They can throw anything they like at you, but once you've accepted that within yourself, that I did fail my children, there were points in their lives when I wasn't good enough. Absolutely, I get that. Hands in the air. So anybody else saying it doesn't trouble me. They can judge me. It doesn't bother me, because I can accept that now. So now that I can accept it, I can work on it. And that's what I did. And the local authority were quite sure that I wouldn't engage in therapy. But I did. I did do 16 months of psychodynamic psychotherapy to look at my issues and to look at why I behaved the way I did, responded to people the way I did, picked the relationships that I did. And I did that right throughout the proceedings. And it is incomprehensible to remove a baby from their mother. It is incomprehensible. And unless you've been through it, you couldn't really hope to imagine the pain of it. And of course, nobody wants to go there. Why would you want to? I don't want you to go there. I don't want you to be in that room with me on Friday, the 12th of July, 2013 at 7:15 p.m. when the midwife came into the room, and I looked at her and asked her if it was time, knowing that the foster carers that were going to take my child and the social worker were sitting in the next room waiting. And my eldest son, Johnny, was sitting on the bed next to me. And I had two friends with me at the time as well. And she walked around the bed and she told me it was time. And I gave my child to the midwife, and she took him, and I just fell forward and screamed and screamed and screamed, and just felt a lot of hands on my back, people around me just desperately wanting to be able to make it stop, but not being able to do so. They couldn't fix this one. It was happening. And I think I genuinely believed that, because I had done nothing to my child, and this was all based around a future risk of me perhaps having a mental health issue or breakdown, or making another poor choice in a relationship, my child might suffer emotional harm because of my choices. So this was all based on future risk rather than anything I'd done to him. I think that made it all the more difficult for everybody around me to accept. They couldn't understand it. They couldn't fathom out, why do you need to take this child? Why can't you keep this child with his mother? Because it does create not only a trauma, but it breaks you in a way that the only thing like it is losing a child permanently, where your child dies. Except that with a child that's removed at birth, or a child that's removed at all, you have the option to fight and keep going whilst grieving for your child, because you do grieve. And I did grieve that night, that weekend, and right throughout those proceedings. And the person that got me through it the most really was Johnny, was my son. And we used to sit, one of the ways that we got through it, because I was still breastfeeding my child, and so I used to have to pump my breast milk every hour to keep my supply up, and also to make sure that he had breast milk that the foster carers could give him. So I was up pumping my milk 12 hours out of 24 every single day. And we got into a routine of watching the Olympics, the London 2012 Olympics on DVD. And we just used to sit watching that over and over. But it was like our grounding, it was something that was totally emotionless, other than the joy of seeing somebody win something or do well or achieve. And so it was so far removed from what was going on in our real lives at that time. And yeah, that definitely, there are some interesting memories of me sitting with a double breast pump and my son going, I can't unsay that. And then us watching, the opening ceremony of the 2012 Olympics and trying to not look at each other at all while I'm being milked like a cow. And, so there are strategies that you employ. There are things that you have to do to keep yourself sane. But ultimately, I think what we all forget and don't always want to hear is that removal creates a trauma.
And that's the thing that I think I'm so kind of intrigued really by, how women have been so forgotten in that process, because we now can, we're much more able to have better conversations about the trauma for the child, but we're still so far away from talking about the trauma for the mother. Although things have improved, I think, a little. And it's really interesting when you talk about rocking your baby to "You Are My Sunshine," that's not the image that's peddled across some of the mainstream media about women who end up having their children taken into care. There's a real contrast there, isn't there? Because what that means is, it means that you were a mum, you were breastfeeding, you were singing to your child, just like I breastfed and I sang to my child, and the social workers you're working with may well have also sang and breastfed. It means that you're not the other. And so that's what has to happen in terms of changing that narrative. And I guess that's one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the people who write to you, I'm guessing, around how they're seen, how they're viewed, and what kind of shame-inducing sensations that brings up for somebody being involved in those kind of proceedings.
It was horrendous. I mean, even during the first set of proceedings, I would go to see my children during sort of for contact, and go to the schoolyard, and I wasn't allowed on my own with them. I hadn't battered them or beaten them. I'd actually made an attempt on my own life, because I felt like I was a burden, and I felt like I was actually causing more pain to my family. And I was also in a very, very abusive relationship that I couldn't see a way out of. It was a very violent relationship, very emotionally abusive relationship, because I couldn't see a way out. It spiraled completely out of control, and I didn't have anywhere to go for help. So, and it culminated, and it was May the 2nd, 2012, that it culminated in me taking a massive overdose. And again, it's horrendous and it's very sad, but it's also, I now can see that as being, yeah, of course I wasn't thinking straight, but I should have been thinking straight, because I was a mum first, and I didn't think about my children at all at that time. I think at that time I did want to die, to be honest, because I just felt so useless and dirty and horrible. But and again, because of all of the trauma that I'd gone through, and this repeated trauma of this abusive relationship, but I didn't think about my children. But again, I don't fit that even that story alone. You don't fit that media narrative of irresponsible parent drinking, doing drugs, smoking, neglecting their children eating rubbish, and or not eating at all, and children not going to school, or children turn up to school dirty or smelly. None of that happened with me. I didn't fit those. I didn't tick any of those boxes. So immediately it was very difficult for the local authority, I think, because they were faced with somebody who was quite intelligent and articulate, and also willing to fight them. And because I didn't believe that it was correct to remove, was certainly not remove my baby at birth, but I could see that I needed to make changes. And I can remember going to contact and going into the schoolyard with a contact supervisor who had a name badge on and a bloody lanyard to say what she was, and everyone staring, people like that I'd known for like 15 years staring at me, and not knowing what I'd done. She must have done something. And then certainly when I had my baby and I had my baby removed, the talk on the estate, which I'd then moved away from because I'd moved into a refuge to get away from my partner and break the cycle of that alone. But the talk and the Chinese whispers on the estate that I lived on, the council estate, was, God, I think one of them was that she jumped out the window, jumped out of our window holding her kids, tried to kill herself and her kids. And I was like, when did this happen? But the shame of having to then go and show your face on that estate to enable you to see your children in contact, it's horrendous. That alone is hard enough, and then you're up against an entire local authority who are standing in a courtroom telling you that you're not good enough to have your children, and that again is so disempowering. And I can completely understand why some parents just give up and walk away, because Not that I ever came close, but I came close to understanding why, and I still now understand why you get to that point. And
can I just ask, was this the same local authority that you were in care to?
yeah.
Yeah. And at any point in that process, was there any understanding, comprehension, desire to make sense of their part in what had happened for you during care and the therapeutic healing that was, I mean, I'm not saying you were ready for it. You've said already that, you were not in the place to respond to it, but was there any kind of acknowledgement that, you'd had a particular set of experiences that had meant that the local authority felt that they would be able to do better? And on some degree, I'm guessing that they did, from what it sounds like. And on many other degrees, they didn't. They failed to protect you. Did that come up at all? Because I'm quite intrigued by this cycle,
Never once have the local authority acknowledged. Well, actually, no, that's a lie. They have once acknowledged, a senior member of staff acknowledged to a national newspaper that sometimes in interactions with me, they have been unhelpful. That's about as close as I've got to any sort of insight into what they did to me by not looking after me when they should have done as a teenager. They weren't bothered when I dropped out of school, and I was a straight A student. I could have gone on to university and done really well, I'm sure, with my life. But they weren't there they forgot that they were my corporate parent, and then they certainly forgot that they were my child's corporate grandparent when I was pregnant and in care. And they didn't do anything at all to help me. And there was no level of insight shown. In fact, the fact that I was a care leaver was used against me. It's a story that I hear so often, is that therefore they go diving in, and they think that you don't have the knowledge and resources to be able to look after your child because you've been in care. But I think what they forget is that whilst in care, it's their job to be the corporate parent and to play that step in and play that part. So I have a big issue with local authorities who don't take that role seriously. And I've worked with a lot of local authorities over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and I'm pleased to say that many of them do take that really seriously.
I've seen a big shift. I've definitely seen a shift around understanding that better. And there's so many key messages that have come through. But I think, while we've been talking, but I think if there is a really key message that I would want anyone who's listening to understand, is what you've just said about having that experience of being in care used against you, further shaming you. And I feel really angry when I'm hearing you say that. And I think the fact that you still have that anger, because I know you've done a lot of work on yourself, tells me that you are still getting mail and letters from women who this is happening to.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I still have 2 children in the care system in the same local authority that I was in, who are, in my view, being failed. And they're being failed because I'm not being invited to meetings. I'm not being told about their progress. I've been locked out for the last just over a year. And I've been able to have a conversation with senior members of staff quite recently. We had the same conversation about a year ago when I was assured that everything would change and that I would be included in all discussions around my children still in the care system. And that hasn't happened at all. And the situation continues. And in fact, the senior members of staff that came and sat in my living room just a few weeks ago, and we talked about my children who are in their care, they were saying all the right things to me, but the trouble is the actions don't seem to back it up. And my worry is that my family has been absolutely decimated by this local authority, and not once has anyone said, I don't expect them to say sorry, and I wouldn't probably, not that I wouldn't accept the apology at all, it's not that, it's just that I would rather the apology was really heartfelt and meant rather than prompted because I've had media coverage or somebody's read my story in The Guardian and thinks, oh dear, we better do some damage limitation, which is exactly what happened. There was no authentic, I am really sorry about what you've been through and we haven't been helpful and we took your child and that must have really hurt you. we hurt you, and we can see that you've changed your life, and we can see that you've sustained that change, and you have gone on to be this national figurehead for parents. I sit on the Family Justice Council as a parent and relatives representative, as a public service role, which is one of the greatest honours of my life. And yet still, I'm treated like a second-rate citizen by my own local authority. And so, yes, I am still angry. I think it'll be, again, a long time. And I think there's some healing to be done, with me and my children before we get to a point where we can be a functional family of sorts again. But the only bit I can control really is my bit in it all, and to just keep speaking out, to just keep talking to social workers, talking to local authorities, senior managers, children's charities, lawyers, the judiciary, so that they keep remembering how this feels for a parent. It's so easy to other that parent and box that parent off, particularly when you're in proceedings. It's so easy to just shut down and forget to see that person as a person, real person with feelings. And until we have a more fair, humane system, I'll still be here, hopefully being able to be in the privileged position of being a voice for parents that are either too frightened to speak out, don't feel like they can because they're scared of retribution from the local authority, or they're in proceedings and can't speak out, or just don't have the confidence to do. So I'll keep doing this as long as I need to until I see a change in the system.
Annie, I just love you to death and everything that you stand for. I really do. It's what more can I add? I mean, it's just so inspiring to hear you talk in the way that you talk and take on what sounds to me like yet another quite abusive family in the under the guise of corporate parent, who have been unable to have that really quite open, honest, healing, emotionally intelligent conversation like the one that you just described. The disappointment I feel at a local authority being so arrogant that it can't sit down with you and undergo the type of conversation that you're capable of having because of the therapy and work that you've done, that they are not able to do that, leaves a very bitter taste in my mouth. Now, if people want Annie to come and talk at their organisation or their local authority or their charity, where can people find you? What's the best way to get hold of you?
The best way probably is through my website, or you can email me directly, which is survivingsafeguarding@gmail.com. And I can come and talk. I work with a lot of local authorities across the country, some who are far more progressive than my own or than others. I would love to work within my own local authority, and I would always extend that invitation to my own local authority, in that I would love to be given the opportunity for them to listen to me, and I think what they need to understand is I think what the wider social work world needs to understand is that we have to help parents to own their own mistakes, and we can only do that by supporting them and caring about them and being kind. If you go in there guns blazing, full of blame and shame, parents are just going to shut down, and they're going to feel disempowered, and they're not going to want to work with you. So the message that I'd really like to get out, of course, I'll come and talk to any organisation, but if you take nothing else from today, it's about treating each parent with kindness, because you might be the first person that has ever done that in their lives. You might be the first person that's ever said to that parent, I believe in you, and there's some stuff going on, but you know what, I'm going to sit next to you, and we're going to sit down, and we're going to work this out together, and I will be there, and I will answer your calls, and I will return your calls, and I will not leave you until this piece of work is done. And that's really people who are damaged like me, people who've been through the ringer and been through the care system, been through abusive relationships, and who are pretty alone in the world. That's sometimes all they need, is that person to sit alongside them and be with them. So I'd really love whoever's listening. And I always think when I do this stuff, like no one's listening, and I always get a bit of a shock when I look at my website analytics and I'm like, 15,000, they're clearly all Russian bots. It's like I never think of anyone looking at my website ever. I'm like, who would look at that? It's mental. Like, who am I? Do you know what I mean? But I really hope that anybody listening would take that power of human kindness. Cannot be underestimated, and neither can the power of a parent's capacity to change when someone believes in them. That can't be underestimated either, because I did it and other people can too.
Annie, that's absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Trauma Recovery Resilience podcast with me, your host, Lisa Cherry, brought to you straight from the heart of the knowledge that high quality relationships are the cornerstone of learning, healing, and growing. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider sharing or reviewing. Until next time.